Hey there, and welcome to yet another episode of the Virtual CISO podcast. With you, as always, John Burry, your host, and with me today, a perhaps third-time visitor, Caleb Leidy. Hey, Caleb.
Hey, John. It might even be the fourth.
So don't rub it in. Some people are gonna start getting jealous, especially one you know. Um, so so uh, so I always like to start easy. Tell us a little bit about who you are and what is it that you do every day.
Sure. So, Caleb Leidy, consultant here at PPS in our federal risk and compliance practice. Specializing in CMMC, but also FedRAMP, RMF, NIST security, cybersecurity framework. Basically, anything that's federal regulation, cybersecurity focused, we're here to help you with.
Sounds good, man. Before we get down to business, we always ask, "What's your drink of choice?"
So we have I'm in the Metro Detroit area, and there's a local brewery called Griffin's Claw, and they have a beer called Mr. Blue Sky. It's kind of a citrusy, white wheat ale. Really good stuff.
My next question is, how come I have not been gifted a bottle of this yet? I mean, you
You
could have
didn't
sent me
ask.
Journeyman. So like in Detroit, you also have a distillery that my son likes. Journeyman. You ever been to Journeyman's?
I haven't.
Journeyman's makes a pretty darn solid whiskey that I got while I was out there as a gift, and he ended up drinking it and ended up rebuying his own bottle of it, which because you can get it fairly broadly distributed. All right,
Nice.
so today, like to frame the conversation, let's say we're seeing CMMC rolling out into the DIB finally, and beyond that, as 801 eventually addresses all of the CUI definitions that are contained in the CUI registry, of which there are quite a few, right? If you look at the CUI registry, there are roughly 20 categories, of which defense industrial base data is one of those 20 categories. Um, so we're already hearing from folks that are in the supply chain, most notably managed service providers as an example, that they're being asked questions about what their role is in an organization. If they're servicing an organization that has CUI under at least the DIB requirement right now, they're
Right.
being asked certain types of questions that they're challenged to answer, and we think that's going to get much more broadly defined over the next couple of years as we see this roll out across all definitions of CUI. And I think the key thing is that you and I have chatted about is this concept of shared responsibility and making sure people understand what we mean by that and what a shared responsibility matrix is that. So for this context, please define shared responsibility.
Yeah, so it's kind of self-explanatory, right? There's responsibilities at play for implementing cybersecurity practices, controls, meeting requirements. The overall requirement to to have the framework in place and to be compliant and to be protecting controlled unclassified information is to that organization seeking certification, the OSC. Um, but if they're outsourcing some of these things, right, you might be outsourcing some of your IT, you might be outsourcing some SOC services. There's responsibilities for them because they're providing those services, and the OSC is not you know directly implementing controls on their own behalf, but you still have to make sure that they're being implemented in a way that is compliant to the framework as well. So it's a matter of control and as well as ownership.
So when we talked about the podcast prior, we came up with these three particular use cases, if you will, that are probably good to frame this conversation, right? The idea of which controls an MSP has responsibility for that are within the client's environment, which controls the client has responsibility for in the client's environment, and which controls does the MSP have to implement in the MSP environment to meet DFARS flow down. Now, I think we'd agree there's a lot of complexity depending upon what type of an MSP the organization is.
Right.
Um, so, what is the best way for an MSP, or even if you're not an MSP, if you're a third party service provider to an organization that in your processing CUI, to break this down? Would you, if you were advising an MSP, would it be that you'd help them with a data flow diagram, an L2 scoping guide, asset classes? Would be the way you'd look at it? Kind of think about how somebody should think about this.
Yeah, and perhaps you could do it either of those ways. I like to see it from the perspective of the OSC going through the practices in, let's say, a gap assessment or a self assessment, and identifying, hey, for this practice, we know our MSP manages that. For this practice, we know our MSP manages that. So you can start to lay out the responsibilities that way, and also make sure that they're being implemented in a way, that is in compliance with 800-171 CMMC. If you look at the scoping guide, and shame on you for using such naughty language, scoping guide. MSPs actually are in there as an asset type, right? A security protection asset. And there's a lot of talk around security protection assets that are more typically geared toward technologies. But if you look at people and services as a security protection asset, they're providing services. They're doing things, providing functions that will give evidence to implementing controls to meet the requirements. But then they also are subject to protections as well. We look at access control, physical protections for the environment, not only in the OSC's environment but also in the MSP's environment, to make sure that data is still properly protected for confidentiality. So it really, I would look at it from a practice to practice perspective and what services they're providing.
Real quick, when you say practice to practice, are you referring to the practices the MSP offers? So if they're offering, let's say, break fix on site, you'd look at that practice differently than you might look at one where they're providing a security monitoring, security operations center style practice. Is that what you meant by practice?
Yeah. So the services that they're providing and the CMMC practices, right? The 800-171 requirements. What are the functions that they're actually providing? What's their operational function? Are they doing that in a way that's meeting the intent of the requirement for 800-171, the practice for CMMC? A lot of folks are getting to the point where they're taking overall and trying to classify assets and then later out and figure out what they do. Not to any fault of their own, assessments haven't started in the industry yet on the commercial side. Coming from doing these assessments in the DIBCAC, it comes with an understanding of, you get into assessment mode and you start running through the requirements, right? There's an understanding of the scope and of the environment, and maybe if there's third parties involved, but you really aren't looking too deeply into those until you get to a requirement or a practice and say, oh, our MSP does that, and this is how they do it. So now you're going to start looking more closely at those. Where the scoping guide comes in, and I think has been good to help in that, is that if you look at it from practice to practice perspective, then you may neglect to go back and say, okay, well, that MSP has security functions and people with security functions. Are we making sure that the access control is proper for them? Are we making sure that they're following the company's guidelines on viewing and handling and working with CUI outside of a controlled space? Those other things where we're looking at protecting the people and how they function, so that we're not losing confidentiality of data, as opposed to necessarily the very specific things that they are doing.
So there definitely is some complexity to this, right? Because if I'm the client and I have an MSP that is connecting into my environment to remotely manage some IT infrastructure for me, the responsibility to live up to the access control authorization responsibilities lie on me. And then if they're doing, let's say they're providing some type of a service with that access that is also impacting CUI, then they're responsible for ensuring that the way they conduct those practices meets the CMMC or 800-171 requirements?
Yeah, that's the way I would see it.
Okay. Interesting. So can so let's say that I'm an organization that provides, managed services of some sort into the defense industrial base, or more broadly, other organizations that will be impacted by CUI as we move forward. Can I absent of knowing the specific client, can I architect things like in a way that I know will be work for all my clients? Is that the way that you advise them to do that?
I think that would be a great start, right? You can do things in a generalized enough method, right? If you're working absent of a client and you're starting with your MSP and here's the services that we provide, you can set things up to say, all right, within the bounds of our clients, policies, we have services set up. We know what services we provide. We know what requirements those services would speak to, and we know that we're going to have to, access and protect our environment, um, you know, by the client's policies as well, unless the client, then defers and that back and forth. Go to, okay, your policy is good enough. Your policy, your process is good enough if it's into the structure of ours. But focusing, I would, for an MSP, um, absent of client, go ahead and jump in and do a gap assessment, or at least look at your services and understand what services you're providing that are speaking to CMMC requirements, and that just broadens up your ability to answer to those. We've got a long history in the DIB where you get to a client who needs to be 800.171 compliant or needs to get a CMMC certification and are just now finding out that these requirements exist. Now you're going through and doing gap assessments and you're finding out that you need to do this, you need to do this, you need to do this. Well, they've had MSPs this whole time. They're not just grabbing them as we go. So those processes and agreements and contracts between those businesses are already worked out. And if your MSP isn't doing the things that you need to meet your compliance objectives, then you're going to need to rework things or see if they can add to what they're doing or see if they can adjust. But it's it may not be as simple as an MSP that's coming in fresh and already understands where they're helping you meet your compliance objectives.
Right. Right. And I guess from an MSP's perspective, the good news would be is that I think the vast majority of entities, especially those in the defense, currently in the defense industrial base, because many of them are manufacturing concerns that don't have overly robust security programs to begin with, that as long as you architected the delivery of your services in a way which was 801.71 compliant, more likely than not, you're going to live up to their policy, their requirements. I think it would be unlikely if you met those requirements that you'd fall outside of their requirements.
Right. That makes
Do you
sense.
agree with that? Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So does that change much? So the way that we just that part of our conversation was around, us acting in their environment. How does that change, dependent upon whether or not we're providing a service which is, specifically called out in the scoping guide?
Be more specific, John.
So you've got what if I recall correctly, I don't have the guide open in front of me, but we got these idea like security protection assets, right? So if I was providing like a SOC service, right?
Okay.
Managed MDR, XDR, SOC, whatever we want to call it these days. I never know, managed SIM, they all seem to mean the same thing. But if I was providing that type of a service, and that service, that's a little bit different. I'm not necessarily going into their environment to do something. Their data is coming to me and I'm providing a service which is integral to their system security plan.
Gotcha. Yeah, so same perspective, right? They've got that technology that you're running on their behalf is providing a function to their environment, that is critical as part of the requirements. So they have to, when assessment time comes, and it's just good to know for internal business processes anyway, be able to provide evidence that is controlling protection. Right, controlling, putting security controls in place in a way that meets the requirements. So if we look at a SIM, right, that someone else is managing, you've got all kinds of requirements in the AU family that go into what are you logging, how are you logging it, what are your records look like, which if someone else is managing that for you, you may not have a great amount of insight into day to day, but you should know what they're doing, be able to provide evidence of what they're doing, and have a lot of insight into that if you need to get to it, right? To provide evidence or to, respond to critical information that comes from that kind of service. It goes into another aspect, and it might have been what you're getting at, right? Is if CUI is actually, being
Yeah,
transmitted.
that was the
Right.
next question I was going to go, right? Because there's, under normal conduct of a system, ideally you would not have CUI ending up in, your logs. But if we were doing NetFlow or something like that, or there was something else going on, yeah, you might have CUI actually transit, which would completely change the requirement for the managed service provider, correct?
It would, and that's a really interesting aspect that a lot of people get into. Is if someone is, processing, storing, transmitting CUI on your behalf, you have flow down requirements. If it's unintentional, then you have a failed control, right? And you have a spillage, maybe a reportable incident, and something that you need to button up and have a process to deal with in the future. If it's intentional, now you have flow down requirements, that you'll flow it down, and there's, certain might be subcontract or what have you, but that organization is now going to have their own CMMC requirements to deal with. And that has been, I've had some discussions with folks recently, and people get pretty upset about it. They're like, if you're looking at an OSC and they're sending CUI elsewhere to, an MSP, then, do we gather evidence and make sure that MSP has a CMMC level 2 certification? Not during that assessment, you don't, because that's really adding requirements, right? The OSC right now doesn't have an obligation, a legal obligation or requirement within the CMMC framework or the 800-171, which is what's going to be being assessed, to ensure that third party has a CMMC certification. Now, that third party is going to be required to have a CMMC certification, right? Or 800-171 compliance. And that's between really them and the government. Even the flow down, it's all a contractual perspective, right? So a commercial assessor doesn't really have the authority or the obligation to pursue that avenue much further, right? You can ask it maybe during an assessment, hey, did you check to see if that organization has a score in SPRS? Yep, we did, and they sent us a letter that said they're compliant, so on and so forth. Great. If they say, that's a contractual matter and we don't want to discuss that with you for our assessment, it really would be adding to the requirements for CMMC or 800-171 specifically to pursue that a lot farther. And it's really a government function at that point.
Yeah, but we're talking about in my humble opinion, a very significant loophole, right? Because, yes, CMMC is what we're obligated to, which is basically obligation 800-171, but the 800-171 obligation comes from DFARS, whether it's a 7012 or, usually a 7012 because that gets added to the 7019 and 20. So under the DFARS 7012, we have that responsibility to flow it down. So it's a very weird situation to me that you're going in there as an auditor. You know that CUI is flowing into another environment. You know that there's a DFARS clause that necessitates them to flow down the requirement and have evidence that they've done so, but yet you have no capability of that seems a little off. Do you think that's something that people are talking about and saying, hey, we got to figure out a way to fix this? Because I think I think you're going to see a lot of problems there.
I think you would see problems, and it really depends, right? And again, they would really have their own contract requirements. It would be the same. That MSP would get requirements flowed down to them if they knew that, hey, we know that we're passing CUI through that MSP environment, so we're going to flow down the contract clause to ensure that they're properly protecting the data. But it's all in the bounds of the OSC's assessment, right? And that's why when we look at it from an overall perspective of a business to business relationship versus when we're actually looking at an assessment perspective.
Mm-hmm.
As an assessor, you're not certifying or looking at the compliance of that third party. You're looking at the functions that they're providing and the people and resources that are being used for the OSC that you're assessing are in compliance.
No, I understand, but I mean, clearly look, I mean, at the end of the day, we want to protect CUI. The idea that you can go in and give someone a CMMC level 2 certification, knowing that they're flowing data down to multiple sources that they have no evidence are actually conforming with 800-171 or have a score in SPRS or have their own CMMC, sounds nuts to me.
Primes have been doing it for years.
I know, which is why we have CMMC, right? No, seriously.
Yeah, but
I mean, like
DCMA.
Yeah. So, I mean, look, but DCMA can't go out and look at, so what's going to happen? So you're saying that in order for, I'm Joe manufacturer, I run John's manufacturing company, I'm providing CUI downstream to somebody. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So let me go a different direction. If we didn't go MSP, if we went, I was flowing it down to a sheet metal shop. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
and you're in there for CMMC. I'm assuming the same thing holds, that you have no obligation to look to see whether or not up. So at the end of the day, the government did this to protect CUI. We know every organization flows down a lot of CUI, but we're not going to look at that as part of a CMMC assessment. I'm sorry, but there's definitely a little bit of a gap there that somebody should be looking at to say, how do we address this?
Right. And so there is, to an extent, right? And they brought in the 70/20, which we've talked about a bit, and that clause actually has the requirement you can't give a subcontract without validating that the subcontract, if your CUI is involved, is to with a company that has a score in SPRS.
Okay, but that like 7012 was, right? There's the only way that ever gets enforced is through a False Claims Act or a DCMA knock on your door, and the DCMA does not have nearly the bandwidth, as you know, because you worked for the DCMA and DIPCAC, the bandwidth to go around and knock on 80,000 entities' doors.
Right, and I don't think that that MSPs are included in that 80,000 number.
Right.
Either.
They're absolutely not.
And so you look at that. DCMA does have. It's not just DIPCAC. It's a huge organization, thousands and thousands of employees. There's other functions for contract assessment, right? Contract clause compliance assessments. Who would serve more of that function?
So it should be. You're saying that it should be covered through that part of the DCMA. Okay. Yeah. I hope you're right, because otherwise, we've gone a chunk of the way there, but not really as far as I think we ultimately need to go.
And I don't know, I really don't think, again, if you're looking at it that way and contracts and how it all goes out, I don't know if anybody's really looking at MSPs in that regard right now, right? And you're going to rely only on, the DIB and the industry partners to say, well, yeah, we know we have CUI, we're subject to 7012 and 19 and 20, and we know that we flow CUI to our MSP. All right, they've called it out for cloud providers, but they've not called out requirements for MSPs.
Okay, so that speaks to it is, and that speaks to the next question I was going to ask you, right? When does an MSP become a cloud service provider, right? Because you are a strong advocate. You're a guy who reads these standards at a level that I don't, and you've pointed out to me multiple times that an entity that's a cloud service provider handling CUI is not beholden to CMMC, right? They're beholden to FedRAMP moderate or equivalent, I think is still the language that's in there. So question for you, let's say you're talking about, let's say Pivot Point is providing an ATT cybersecurity SIM solution to a client, right? And we have access into that environment, and we're providing some reporting to them for CMMC compliance. It is a MSP, right, in a sense, or MSSP relationship at that point, but that's also a cloud service, right? I mean, AT&T cybersecurity is a cloud service. Pivot Point's providing the service to them. do we become a CSP? Is AT&T cybersecurity considered a CSP in that situation, or is it still the MSP and we're only getting the flow down to the 7012?
Yeah, so I think everything you said is accurate, right?
Wrong. No, no.
PPS.
Wow. Usually when you say everything you've said, I think I've known you a year and 3 months. Anytime you've started a sentence with everything you just said, it always is
It's
finished
wrong.
with was wrong. So
Right.
thank you. I feel a lot better today. I must be
Yeah,
learning something.
you did good. I'm glad within a little over a year
It
that
took you a year to train me.
something's
Well,
catching
well
on.
done. Yeah, exactly. So is this the moment where Grasshopper it grabs the rock from the master's hand? Is that what just happened here?
Yeah, something like that. But yeah, so how many levels of flow down do you go? Right, flow down is flow down is flow down. So I think in that situation you laid out, right, PPS would still be an MSP, MSSP. In the grand scheme of things, the actual product offering is the cloud service, right? So their infrastructure and the SaaS product that would come along with that would be what would need to have that FedRAMP moderate authorization or equivalent, right? And you can, of course, you can get FedRAMP authorized for a SaaS or a PaaS or an infrastructure service at all those various levels, which that would be really on AT&T at that point. The obligation to ensure that requirement is in place now moves because
It's
the
now
OSC, the
Yeah,
OSC is flowing down the requirement to their MSP. Their MSP has some responsibilities there, but now any subsequent flow down, right? We're passing CUI to another environment, and that's a cloud environment, and so now we have an obligation to ensure that FedRAMP is there.
Yeah, pretty soon you're going to be asking your babysitter for a CMMC certification. It'll only be L1 maybe, but no, seriously. I mean, when you start to think about the way that data flows between organizations, at some point when the federal government turns this on completely, I mean, how many organizations are not going to at some point have some type of data that's classified as CUI, through some type of a flow down or a flow down of a flow down? It's going to get crazy.
It's going to be really messy. There's some predictions out there that because of marking and identifying CUI, that essentially anything that's not marked or currently is called FOUO or sensitive but unclassified is just going to be called CUI by the government, which is concerning, right? It's not how it should work. But if you think about the task at hand, we say, all right, right now we have everything marked FOUO, and we've dealt with it as FOUO for a long time. So now, as the government, we've got to go back and look at all of our FOUO and put it into buckets. Is this CUI? Is this FCI? Is this unclassified? And it's not going to be pretty.
Well, look, and we don't want to overtreat risk, right? That's a fundamental concept in information security. But at the end of the day, if you want to be a viable business, right, an 800.171 conforming environment is conceptually highly similar to an ISO 27001 conforming environment, highly similar to a SOC 2 conforming environment. And those are sort of becoming the baseline responsibility to be an organization that isn't at significant risk to going out of business independent of its contractual obligations. So I think honestly, really, and I think the presidential executive order and the guidance coming out of CISA is sort of saying the same thing. And if we're going to continue to be an economic player, and have our sovereignty and have national defense, right, that we really do need most organizations to end up at a 800.171 or similar style environment.
Right. Yeah, I mean, and they should, and they're going to keep moving on through trying to put this program in place. The way I see it, we're talking about MSPs, right? And it's fun that we bring up the FedRAMP requirement, which I just think is ridiculous. But if we look at the FedRAMP requirement and we say, well, how's this play out for MSPs? It's not really structured with requirements around MSPs. The whole industry has had a problem with not doing anything around this area until we started seeing some enforcement of the requirements. Um, you know, what if the government comes out and says, similar to a cloud provider who's not even providing services to the government, because you use them for CUI purposes, they now have to have FedRAMP moderator equivalent. For an MSP that's providing services, what if they were to just say they have to have an RMF ATO moderate level or equivalent? That's really no different than the FedRAMP requirement that's there right now. And MSPs just they're not going to do that. That's crazy. Right. And I don't think the FedRAMP requirement is right either. That's another topic. But, just looking at that same logic, you're either going to have to start requiring a CMMC certification or provide the circumstances to say that this is how an MSP is scoped into an OSC's, certification and responsibilities. And here's some of the requirements, but laying out those requirements. And like you said, it's not well policed right now. I do think that it's, being seen and looked at. So, the results of, trying to make determinations on what those requirements should be might be a scary thing to think of coming from the government.
Yeah, it's going to, like we've said, how many times, it's going to be an interesting next 5 years. So I know that I've heard you talk with MSPs with regards to this concept that they should develop a shared responsibility matrix. Why do you think that's so valuable to them?
Yeah, so kind of along the lines of what I was saying earlier, if an MSP understands that they provide pretty standardized services across the board to their clients, they can start to look at how their controls are meeting CMMC practices, 800-171 requirements, and have that preset. So we know this is what we do and what we control. We know that for this same set of requirements that you, our client, are going to need to take part of it, and here's exactly what those things are. Here's what we do and how we're meeting it. Here's what you need to do to ensure that you're meeting it. And you have that all laid out ahead of time. You have an MSP who understands your compliance needs and is helping you, and then two, you have an MSP that can be looked at from C3PAOs, from anybody doing gap assessments, consulting services. If you have that all laid out, similar to a CSP, we have the FedRAMP system security plans and customer responsibility matrices, and they lay those all out. And where a CSP, most of the time it's like there's still some ownership from the client to configure things or how they act in that environment. I think it would be different from an MSP's perspective, just knowing, hey, we know that we've got this set of requirements fully met. We know that there's these pieces for you to do to fully meet these requirements, and you take out your level of work for compliance, as opposed to looking at it as from an IT or a implementing controls perspective. We already know what our compliance looks like, so that makes it easier across the board. It's better for the MSP because then they don't have somebody that has to come every time and ask questions. What do you do for this requirement? What do you do for this requirement? And you don't have to, you have a level of, comfort and reliability from their potential clients to say, all right, we know exactly what we're getting into.
So it's a marketing advantage on the first case, right?
I would say
I guess
definitely.
The second thing is it would be an effectiveness and efficiency of operations advantage, in that if I defined a standardized way I do something and I tell my potential clients and clients that that's the way we do it, and they architect around that, then I don't have to have 12 variations in place, right? I can say, because if you think about it, when you go to Microsoft, you don't get a chance to say, hey, this is what I want. Microsoft says, this is how we do it. If you want to buy it, go ahead, right? And they do
Right.
that for effectiveness and efficiency of operations. And I guess you already pointed to the other side of effectiveness and efficiency of operations is that if you have smart clients, they will flow down the requirement, and you're going to be asked for documentation to reflect that. And that responsibility matrix is that documentation. And you're providing that from the very first moment that you start working with them.
Right.
Right. That's pretty cool. I would think that,
Yeah.
I would think that that would absolutely be the right way to go.
Yeah.
Um,
I think it's key.
question for you. I'm looking at our notes. I think we beat up the MSP idea pretty well. Is there anything that we missed
Mhm.
in terms of like some of these subtle variations, of what they might run into?
No, I don't think so. A lot of the times, if we look at one thing I would add, kind of just along the last thought we were going back and forth with on the shared responsibility matrix, is most of the time, MSPs are being contracted to fulfill an IT service, right? And where they're going to be lacking is going to be in documentation and policies and procedures, but those need to come from inside the organization, the client organization, anyway, right? Because that's that's just where that's going to fall. So it's easy to lay out that way. Hey, you tell us what your policies, processes, procedures are. We've already got a set baked in way of how we do things, and we can line those up. This is what I was getting at earlier, like the vagueness, right? We do, at our MSP, we do configuration management via, group policy management. Okay, well, for our particular instance, these are what, group policy things that we say we absolutely have to have and how they're going to be set. Great. So now we do group policy, management down to these are the settings within our group policy,
Mm-hmm.
within our
Question.
policies, group policies.
Something that made me think of that I hadn't thought of before. So you do FedRAMP work. So you're deploying your solution in either AWS or Azure. The
Mhm.
SSP you use is the one that you grab off of their site because it's pre-populated so that the controls that they're responsible for, right, their version of the responsibility matrix, if you will, is actually outlined within the SSP itself, right? So you can see that you're
Yeah.
absorbing that control. Would would that logically hold as another thing an MSP should consider doing? Would be to actually have a system security plan template, with for a service that defines which of those controls. Because I mean, can you imagine, like, I mean, as somebody who's got to implement an SSP and has all of these holes in their document to fill, if I was looking at a client and excuse me, looking at a particular service provider, and they were saying, hey, here's how it matches up, so you can just point to our controls in all of these sections, that would seem to be pretty
Mm-hmm.
valuable.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And and that's kind of what I was getting at, right? Is if they lay that out ahead of time, putting it into an SSP with your control implementation in there is a great way, right? So you can have those, um, you know, inherited, shared, or client responsibility all laid out, and that makes it super easy for a client to come in and know what they need to do, and to already have the documentation that they need for evidence and verification that those practices are being met.
I'm just looking at our notes. Yeah, we covered the MSTP stuff pretty good. Appreciate that. So let me ask you to geek out a second. Because any MSPs that is listening to this really needs to be aware of, like, what's the timeline when all this stuff is going to happen. So we know that the legal contractual wheels are turning in DC as we speak, and I know there's a bunch of documents that I don't fully understand all of them. I know you've referred to FAR Case 2017-016. I know the one that I know a little bit about is 48 CFR and 32 CFR. So when are all these going to go into effect, and what are the likely implications to an MSP that's listening?
So things that are coming from the DoD and the CMMC rulemaking process, within various portions of the 48 CFR and the 32 CFR, um, 9 to 24 months from last November. Right? Uh, maybe, who knows? CMMC assessments and how CMMC views things, right? And it talked a little bit earlier about our naughty language was saying scoping guide, but the scoping guide starts referring to MSPs more than we've seen other documentation refer to MSPs. So as CMMC assessments start rolling during the voluntary period, which could be as soon as next month, we'll start to see how MSPs are assessed, from the eyes of C3PAOs and the CMMC accreditation body. And then, as we see the final rules come out, the FARS CUI rule, which is the case 2017-016, that's expected sometime this year. And I don't think we'll see a whole lot specific to MSPs in that one. More around the federal CUI program and standardization across the board. For the DoD rules, I also am not sure how clear they're going to be. Right? They haven't so much in the past, but like I said, they have things like the FedRAMP requirement for cloud service providers. They could very well range from anything from you need to have a CMMC certification as an MSP that's receiving CUI, right, processing, storing, transmitting CUI, down to a moderate ATO or equivalent for RMF, right, in the 853.
Yeah, so you took that question in a different direction than I was intending it, but that was actually pretty cool. I was intending in a slightly different direction as to when 48 CFR, now refresh my memory, 48 CFR is the non-DOD version, right? And 32 CFR is the DOD, or did I get that backwards? I always mix them up.
32 CFR is national security, and there's a bunch of different sections.
Right.
Part 2002 is CUI that comes from
but
NARA.
48 is the more generic one, right? That's the one that applies across the entire government, correct?
So 48 Chapter 1 is the FAR,
right,
which applies across the federal level. 48 Chapter 2 is the DFARS, which gets the DoD specific.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. Now you know why I'm confused. All right. So what I was really kind of going in the direction of is that when 48 CFR Part 1, right, that when that goes into contracts, begins to go into contracts, right? That would, in theory, immediately make all 19 other classes outside of the DIB, right? All contracts that were involved in processing CUI would suddenly be beholden to that standard, right? That's incorporated into every standard, every contract. So that any person that's processing CUI. So if you're an MSP but you don't deal with the DIB, right? You're dealing with financial, you're dealing with transportation, any of these industries that are specified in there, intellectual property, legal, healthcare. In theory, the minute that 48 CFR Part 1 goes to press, then everyone who processes that data is subject to CMMC, right? Or NIST 80171, I guess would be a better way to say it.
Yeah, more 80171, or there's various, and that's why it's such a mess right now, right? There's so many different regulations, things that make CUI categories specified, that are extra requirements on top of the 80171 or the basic CUI safeguarding rules, and that's what is part of the reason why it's taking them so long to work this all out. Right, it started 2010 with the executive order, so here we are 12 years later. Almost getting to starting the program, but they're one of the CUI blog from NARA, the last one that they put out, talks about kind of taking those specified categories, working out the small intricacies of some of the specified categories and what those extra requirements are, and bringing those categories to basic. So we're left with really the 80171 compliance.
All right. Now, we hadn't talked about this prior, but considering the fact that the 80172A dropped today or just recently, that in theory puts us closer to a audit program or assessment of a CMMC L3, assuming that CMMC V2 L3, and assuming a CMMC V2 L3, the presumption is that the requirement for that will be 800-172. So is that a fair assessment? And and if so, where do you think that's going? How long will you think that will be? I mean, I know we're just swagging. And then the second thing is, how likely would it be that that might impact an MSP?
Okay, so I think it would impact an MS. I'll start with the MSP piece.
Mm-hmm.
I think it would impact an MSP the same exact way that everything is currently impacting MSPs. Right? You got to find out where they fit into it. What controls they're meeting and are responsible for, what their requirements are, and how they're supporting the OSCs. The 172 is that they're not intending to use all of the requirements from that for the level 3. And what's really interesting is I look back to where they said bifurcation, right, for level 2, and they're like, well, we're going to assess some and not. Some is more critical. Level 3 is the more critical, right? That's why we can't do it at level 2. Everything's kind of at that set level. But we have very critical programs that deal with CUI that are going to be held to a higher standard, and that's level 3. So whenever they figure out what those very critical programs are, then that's where I see they'll start pulling out and making the requirements set that they'll pull from the subset of 172 requirements. And I expect CMMC level 3 to line up precisely to that, right? The 110 from 171 at the level 2 right now, with the additional whatever they pull for those critical programs from the 172 would go to the level 3 CMMC. So I don't think it's overly complicated outside of figuring out what those critical programs are, which they should have a pretty good idea of, and it gets rid of the kind of the nagging concept of is there less or more critical CUI at the level 2,
right?
And I would say no, right? So they'll figure that out. They'll pull the requirements set. It'll port right over to CMMC level 3, and you really have the same assessment process from there.
Gotcha. And then do you think I know when they talked about the original bifurcation, they referred to it as prioritized acquisitions, and I think they gave examples of munitions, command and control, and communications, or I think those were the 3 groups that they said as an example. Do you think that we're going to align with the program, or do you think that we're going to end up aligning with CUI specified, or do CUI specified and programs go hand in hand anyway, and it's 6 one half dozen of another?
They don't, right? So the data types are just really coming down to what kind of sector they're in. I think it'll go to the programs, right? If you look at contract programs, you might have a specific fighter jet, and we know the F-35 is a big example of CUI protection reasons and origins, right? So if you take the F-35, you've got a contractor who's the prime on that, and then you've got all these subcontractors that are down to it. So you might have a subcontractor 6-7 tiers down the supply chain who is dealing with CUI for a very critical contract program like the F-35, who now might need to be level 3.
Okay, and that was
the program that is associated with.
And it might even differ depending upon what that 6th level down subcontractor is doing, right? A sheet metal shop might be different than an antenna shop, right? Somebody that's involved in guidance of the aircraft or its missiles would be a little bit different than somebody who's bending a piece of metal that's going to go around a wheel well.
Yeah, okay. And it's same for flow down, right? That I don't think the flow down verbiage is going to change. You need to identify what the CUI is, and if the data retains its identity as covered defense information for that subcontractor.
Gotcha. Anything else we missed, sir?
I don't think so. It's been lots of fun. I've got lots more to talk about, but not. We don't have enough time.
I wore you out, huh? I have a tendency to do that. So, do you want to go for the fictional character, the amazing horrible CISO? You've done it at least once before. Do you want to go for it again, or you want to beg out?
I, on this third and or fourth time that I've been on the podcast, Sean,
Stop
I
rubbing
don't
it in other
think
people's noses. Okay, I mean it's going to cause a problem. I
he'll
mean,
be all
there's a
right.
long line of people that want to be on the show, and I've let you grace, this episode again. I mean, come on. All right, so you're going to
No,
pass on
it's
that.
very
I
important.
take it.
No,
All
I
right.
don't think I've been given the opportunity to
You haven't? All right,
yet
so
at
let's
this
go with it.
point.
All right, well then I hope you're prepared. So give me a fictional character or a real world person you think would make an amazing or a horrible CISO, and why.
All right, so I'm gonna go. Recent events here and everything that's going on. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, I think, would make an amazing CISO,
Wow.
um, because he's shown that he's understands high level concepts and prioritizations and strategies, but is also not afraid to get down at ground level and be involved in the team that's carrying out and implementing those strategies as well.
Yeah, and he's an astute political. Um, his actions are pretty clever. Like, the way he's called out NATO, he's called out the U.S. I mean, he really understands. He understands how to use the press. Not that you have the press inside of an organization, but you still have those same kinds of politics, and you need to be able
Mm-hmm.
to kind of create the same kind of pressures by putting people in tough spots. So that's a really interesting one. And the other guy that was pretty cool too. Did you see the picture of? I think he was the mayor of Kiev. Guy looked like Rock.
Mm.
You know what I mean? And like he was the mayor, and he's like in battle gear, and he's like, I'm not a politician who's hiding in an office somewhere, and like he's at the front
Yeah.
lines waiting for him. Yeah, it's a dreadful situation what's going on over there. I say a prayer for everyone involved, and I pray that we have some fast and painless end to the conflict, because it's dreadful to see some of the crap that's going on.
This-
If someone wants to get in touch with you, I know you're active on LinkedIn. Anywhere else that someone might reach out to you?
Yeah, Caleb Leidy on LinkedIn. I'm in the CMMC CUI Discord CUI that everybody loves to get involved in. So I'm in there, and then Caleb.Leidy at pivotpointsecurity.com. Feel free to
Awesome, man.
reach out.
As always, it's been fun, man. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Sean.